It started like any other spring morning in Brooklyn, buses rumbling down Flatbush, the hum of early commuters pouring onto the subways, the distant clatter of delivery trucks turning onto narrow side streets. I had just finished feeding the colony of feral cats near the Navy Yard when my phone buzzed. It was my friend Amir from the Dot. "You near the bridge?" he asked, voice tight with urgency. "Brooklyn Bridge? No, why?" "There's a dog on the walkway. A small one. Terrier or something. Causing a scene, people stopped, traffic's backed up. We're trying to keep him safe. Can you come?" I was already moving before I answered. By the time I got to the Manhattan entrance of the bridge's pedestrian walkway, it was chaos. A cluster of tourists stood on tiptoe with their phones raised. Cyclists veered off to avoid a little brown blur darting between people's legs. 2 NYPD officers stood nearby, unsure whether to chase or wait. And there, in the middle of it all, was Leo. He didn't have a name then. Just a wiry little stray, about 10 pounds, tan and white with tufts of fur sticking up in every direction. He looked like he'd just come out of a wind tunnel. His face was sharp and alert, with big, dark eyes that constantly scanned his surroundings. He wasn't barking or growling, but you could tell, he was scared and trying to figure out how he'd gotten here. The Brooklyn Bridge walkway isn't quiet. It vibrates with sound, the subway clatters below, cars honk above, and people, always people, move in waves. And yet this dog, who probably hadn't known a steady home in months, had somehow wandered onto it, weaving through throngs of joggers and tourists like he belonged there. "He came from the Brooklyn side," someone said to me. "I saw him trotting up the ramp, like he had somewhere to be." Another woman added, "He didn't even hesitate. Just walked right up and kept going." I crouched down and watched him. You learn things when you volunteer in rescue long enough, how to read the subtle signs of stress, the moments before a dog bolts. Leo wasn't bolting. He was walking deliberately, like he had a plan, but didn't know how it ended. He paused near the bridge's center, right under the suspension cables, his little chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. Every time someone tried to get close, he slipped away, never aggressive, always just a step out of reach. A cyclist got too close, and Leo ducked toward the edge of the walkway. He pressed himself against the railing, clearly confused about what to do next. I motioned to the officers. "I'm with East River Rescue," I said. "Let me try." One of them nodded. "We've already called animal control, but they're stuck in traffic." I walked slowly. No leash, no treats. Just calm, measured steps and a steady voice. "Hey, buddy, you've had a big morning, huh?" I said, kneeling a few feet away. "Brooklyn Bridge, that's quite a commute for a guy your size." He looked at me, not directly, more like sideways, like dogs do when they're trying to decide whether you're a threat or an ally. I kept talking, soft, nonsense words, the kind that don't mean anything, but say everything in tone. The crowd had quieted. It was like everyone collectively understood that the moment had become delicate. You could hear the wind shift, the slight creak of suspension cables above us. Leo sat down, not all the way, more like a crouch. But it was something. I took it as permission to inch closer. I reached out my hand, palm up. And then, one of those moments you remember for the rest of your life, he leaned in and sniffed. I didn't grab him. I waited, let him figure out that I wasn't going to take his freedom by force. After a few seconds, he stepped toward me, his front paw light on the wood planks, ears still back but no longer shaking. I slipped the loop of a leash over his head in one slow motion. No panic. He didn't flinch. He just let out a deep, audible sigh and leaned against my leg. The entire walkway seemed to exhale. People clapped quietly, some took photos, others just smiled and moved on. But I stayed kneeling, my hand on his tiny back, feeling the rise and fall of his breath as he finally let himself rest. "Where did you come from, little guy?" I whispered. That was the question. Because dogs don't just wander onto the Brooklyn Bridge. Not without a story. Over the next few days, I'd come to learn bits and pieces of Leo's path. How he had likely been living in an alley behind a closed-down bodega on Classen Avenue, how neighbors had seen him darting across Atlantic in the early mornings, how someone might have tried to catch him weeks before, only to give up when he slipped through a broken fence. But that was later. For now, Leo was safe. I carried him off the bridge, tucked in my arms like a tired child, past onlookers and street performers and traffic cops. He didn't squirm once. Back in my van, I laid him on a blanket, offered him water. He drank in slow, measured gulps. Later, when I posted the story online, it exploded. Everyone wanted to know about the little dog on the Brooklyn Bridge. News outlets called. Volunteers offered help. Some even said, he must be special. He must have been going somewhere. And maybe he was. But to me, Leo's journey wasn't about where he was headed. It was about the quiet kind of courage. The kind it takes to keep walking when you're scared, to step into the unknown with nothing but your instincts and a bit of stubbornness. After the bridge, Leo slept for almost a full day. I kept him in the quiet room of the East River Rescue Shelter, a converted brownstone in Vinegar Hill where we housed special cases. He curled up in the crate I'd padded with fleece and lay completely still, his tiny ribs moving just enough to remind me he was still breathing. That kind of exhaustion, deep and bone-heavy, is the kind you only see in dogs who've had to survive too long on their own. He hadn't been chipped. No collar. No tags. I scanned him 3 times just to be sure. We put up digital flyers, posted in local lost pet groups, and called every city shelter in case someone had filed a missing report. Nothing. It was as if Leo had walked out of a shadow and onto the bridge. But dogs like Leo don't just come from nowhere. Over the next few days, I watched him closely. He wasn't feral, not truly. Feral dogs don't look people in the eye the way he did. They don't hesitate at a touch but allow it, cautiously. Leo had once been someone's pet. That much was clear. His wariness wasn't born of never knowing humans, it was born of once knowing them and being led down. He didn't bark. He didn't whimper. He just observed. I moved slowly around him, always announcing my presence. I sat near him during meals, not too close. Let him decide when he was ready to eat, which took time. On the 3rd night, he ate a quarter of his bowl. By the 5th, he was wagging, barely, but enough to notice. A local news station picked up his story. Brooklyn Bridge dog rescued in daring morning scene. They aired a clip of him being carried off the bridge in my arms. The phone lines lit up after that. Some people offered money, others offered homes. One woman sent us a tiny custom jacket embroidered with his name. That's when we officially gave him one. Leo. He felt like a Leo. Small, resilient, with a scrappy sort of nobility. The name stuck. At the shelter, we decided not to rush the adoption process. Dogs like Leo needed more than a new address, they needed time to heal, emotionally and physically. His coat was matted around the haunches, his nails overgrown. We sedated him slightly for his first grooming session, then discovered what a handsome little guy he really was. Somewhere along the way, Leo had learned that hands could hurt. Even now, when a stranger reached too fast, he'd flinch. Not a full panic, just a recoil. But with me, he started to relax. I became his constant, feeding him, walking him, sitting with him when the wind howled too loud at night. It's not that he trusted me completely. He didn't, but he tried. Trust is built in inches. And every inch with Leo mattered. One day, I brought him into the small yard behind the shelter. It was fenced, with patches of grass and a few benches. He sniffed the air for a long time, then trotted out, ears high, tail low but wagging. It was the first time I saw him play. Not with toys, he wasn't ready for that. But with the space. He explored it like a scout. Claimed it with his little footsteps. That same week, we got our first lead. A man from Crown Heights called and said he'd seen Leo weeks ago, behind an old bodega that had closed after a fire. He said the dog had lived in the alley, picking through trash bags, running off if anyone got too close. He's smart, the man said. Wouldn't let anyone near him. But he'd watch. Always watching. I went to check it out. The bodega was boarded up. There were broken crates stacked along the back wall and a rusted fence leading to a narrow alley. A couple of neighbors said they'd seen the dog too, thought he might have belonged to the owner before the fire, but no one was sure. The store had been closed for months. The owner had moved out of state. So Leo had been alone, possibly for weeks, maybe longer. Back at the shelter, I sat with him that night and told him what I'd found, even though he couldn't understand. Still, he looked at me the way he always did, deep and steady, like he wanted to say something but knew we didn't speak the same language. Over time, Leo became the kind of dog people wanted to meet. He'd walk on a leash now, hesitantly at first, then with a trot. He'd stop and stare at subway grates, the way he probably used to hide near them. He'd lift his nose toward the wind when he heard the rumble of trains. Something about that sound made him pause every time. He liked quiet people best. Volunteers who didn't push. Kids overwhelmed him, but he never snapped. He just pulled back, waited for stillness to return. One morning, I brought in my own dog, Frankie, a mutt I'd rescued 3 years earlier from under the BQE. Frankie was calm, the kind of dog that made other dogs feel safe. Leo stiffened at first, but after a while, he crept closer. That afternoon, they lay side by side in the sun by the window. It was the closest thing to peace I'd seen in him. That was the day I knew he'd be okay. Not ready, but okay. Word of Leo's progress spread. We had over 200 inquiries. People love a comeback story, especially when it involves a little underdog. But I was careful. I wasn't going to hand him over to just anyone who thought he was cute. Leo needed someone who understood silence. Someone who didn't mind earning his love slowly, over weeks and maybe even years. Someone who'd be okay if he never fetched a ball or learned to sit on command. Someone who'd accept that his affection might come in glances, not cuddles. One evening, a woman named Angela came to meet him. She didn't try to pet him. She sat cross-legged on the floor of the visiting room and read a book out loud. Her voice was low and steady. She didn't even look at him, not at first. Leo watched from the crate. After 10 minutes, he stepped out. After 30, he curled up beside her. I watched from the doorway and didn't say a word. Angela had lost her previous dog, a senior rescue, 6 months earlier. She told me she wasn't looking for another one, but when she saw Leo's story on the news, something stayed with her. I don't know why, she said, but I keep thinking about him. So we began the process. Slowly. Home visits, overnight trials. She kept a journal of his progress. Sent me photos of him sunbathing on her couch, sitting by her side as she worked from home, watching squirrels from the window like they owed him rent. She renamed him officially, but never legally. He was always Leo on paper. At home, she called him Scout. Said it fit his spirit. I visited once, a few months after the adoption was finalized. Leo remembered me. He didn't run to me, didn't jump into my arms. That wasn't his way. But he came to the door, looked up, and gently pressed his head into my hand. That's Leo's version of love. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. I still think about that morning on the bridge. Not because of the chaos or the photos that went viral, but because it's the kind of moment that reminds you why you do the hard work, even on days when it feels like too much. The moment a scared little dog, covered in grime, stopped in the middle of one of the busiest places in New York City and waited, maybe for help, maybe for something he didn't even know he needed. Leo gave us all something that morning. A reason to stop. A reason to care. But it wasn't the end of his story. It was just the middle. Angela and Leo, Scout, as she called him, became something rare, a perfect match. They moved together like they had always belonged to each other. In photos she sent, Leo looked settled. Not like a dog whose life had been chaos, but one who had somehow returned to a version of home he'd never had. Angela kept her apartment quiet and warm, filled with low sunlight and soft spaces for him to hide or rest. She didn't force affection. She just gave him presence. That's what he needed, just someone to stay. She once told me, I don't need him to love me back in any big way. Just knowing he feels safe here, that's enough. But Leo did love her. In his way. He'd follow her from room to room. Not close, just near enough to keep her in sight. He'd sit by the bathroom door while she showered. He never barked, but she always knew where he was. The first time he jumped up on the couch beside her and laid his head in her lap, she cried. She called me that night, voice thick with emotion. It took 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks for him to trust me with his weight. Can you believe that? Yes, I could. That's who Leo was. By fall, he had become a quiet fixture in her neighborhood. They walked early in the mornings, before the city fully woke up. Leo didn't care for crowds or loud noises, but he loved the smell of fallen leaves and the faint rustle of pigeons underfoot. The local bodega owner kept a jar of peanut butter treats behind the counter just for him. And every now and then, Angela would take him to the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge. They never walked it again. She said he'd stop near the entrance, stare up at the cables for a few seconds, then turn back. That was enough. It was like he needed to know it was still there, the path that brought him to her. I visited again that winter. Angela invited me for dinner, nothing formal, just soup and bread in her tiny kitchen. Leo greeted me with a nose bump, then retreated to his spot by the radiator. He watched us the whole time. Calm, present, home. You know, she said, tearing off a piece of bread, I used to think rescue meant saving a dog's life. But Leo, he didn't need saving. He needed someone to notice he was still trying. That stayed with me, because Leo had done something remarkable. Something rare. He rescued himself, just enough to be found. He walked onto that bridge alone. Crossed one of the most chaotic spaces in the city without panicking. Without giving up. He didn't run from the noise, he walked into it. Deliberate, brave, and tired. So incredibly tired. And the city, for once, stopped. Watched. And helped. That's the part people forget. It wasn't just me or the cops or the dot worker who called. It was every person who paused, who pointed, who didn't scare him off. It was the collective care of strangers that made space for him to be rescued. Brooklyn saved Leo. Quietly. Together. A year later, Angela sent a photo on the anniversary of the day we met him. Leo was lying on his back, paws curled, belly exposed, a sign of ultimate trust. A green plush toy rested between his legs. The caption read, "1 year since the bridge. He finally plays with toys." That broke me a little. Because for dogs like Leo, joy isn't loud or immediate. It unfolds slowly, like a sunrise you didn't expect to see. I framed that photo. It hangs in the shelter's intake room now, where scared animals first arrive. A reminder to every new volunteer, progress takes time. But it happens. Always. Every rescue has a beginning. Most start with a call, a post, a tip from a neighbor. But Leo started his own. He stepped into traffic, into noise, into a city that rarely pauses. And somehow, through chance, through instinct, through sheer stubborn will, he found his way to safety. He was never just a stray. Never just a lost dog. He was a survivor who knew, somehow, that someone was out there willing to meet him halfway. And all he had to do was walk forward.